traditional work schedule or a traditional school schedule, your opinion of Fridays is pretty high. It's the last day of the work week. You get a couple days off, and maybe even where you work, there's that casual Friday that kind of hints at the relaxation of the upcoming weekend. Let me share a counter position about Fridays. Fridays aren't my favorite. As a preacher, Fridays are just a reminder that Sunday is just 2 days away, and I've got a lot of work to do. I'm behind. Fridays also evoke for me memories of school. And my memories of Fridays were not that that's the last day of the school week and I get the weekend off, but my mind goes all the way back to elementary school. And in elementary school, for me, Fridays were spelling test days. Every Friday was a spelling test. And we had a routine that consumed the whole week. Monday, usually, you got your spelling words. And if I remember correct, usually a list of 10 new spelling words. You get those on Monday, you'll be tested those on Friday. And sometime during that, and maybe it was Wednesday or Thursday, you had an assignment due. You had to take that list of spelling words and go, and yes, kids, actually to an actual book in the library called the dictionary, and you had to define those words. The teacher didn't want you to just know how to spell them from rote memory. He wanted you to know what those words, sometimes new words, meant. And so you'd go to that dictionary and you had to write the definition. And if you were the lazy student that I was, you got tickled when you opened the dictionary and that word had a 1 or maybe 2 word definition. Like, yes, I can just write 2 words or 1 word and I'm done. And the ones you didn't like it was a whole sentence or maybe a whole paragraph that I had to write all that down. And we like answers like that, don't we? Just short. Yes or no. Give me the synopsis of that. Give me the short answer. Give me the quick, easy thing that I can just file away up here. But you know, sometimes the reason that word in the dictionary doesn't have a 1 or 2 word definition, has a whole sentence, a whole paragraph, is because it's needed. That word's that complex. It needs more words. It needs a further explanation. And that's certainly true of biblical things, isn't it? Can you think of a really important biblical word that can be defined with just 1 or 2 words? When you think of the questions that Jesus was asked while he was here upon the earth, did you notice that Jesus rarely, if ever, just gave a short, pithy answer to a question? A lot of times he would answer a question with a question to get his audience to think about something. And sometimes he would ask a question and it would seem like at first glance that he didn't even answer the question. He just started talking. One such case is in Matthew chapter 18. Will you get your New Testaments and go to Matthew chapter 18, where in verse 1, his disciples come to him with a question that in their minds, I'm sure, should have had a 1-word answer. And that 1-word answer would have rhymed with their first name. They came to him, Matthew chapter 18 and verse 1. At that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is it who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Other such discussions with Jesus and among themselves lead us maybe to the conclusion that again, they were wanting a 1-word answer. Just say me, Jesus. Say Peter, or James, or John, or Andrew. Set these other guys straight. Tell them that's who's the greatest. Or if you're not going to do that, let's be a little bit more subtle. List out just a couple qualities that obviously I have. And so that they'll get the hint that those qualities make up the greatest, and that guy's really good at that, so he therefore is the greatest. But verse 2, Jesus doesn't, at first glance, answer the question. We have a whole chapter of just teaching. But what Jesus is doing, I believe, in the entirety of Matthew chapter 18, in my Bible, there are 35 verses. 34, not counting verse 1, which was the question. I think Jesus answers the question, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And it takes him 34 verses to answer that question. And so let's look at this answer, where Jesus doesn't give them a name. He doesn't give them a real short answer to this. But he says, you want to talk about who's the greatest? Particularly who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And I think Jesus says, okay, let's have that discussion. And so let's look at this lengthy answer to this maybe arrogant question. Who is the greatest? Then Jesus, verse 2, called a little child to him and set him in the midst of them and said, assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. The first aspect in answering this question was, who's the greatest? Who's the lowest? Who's the humblest? Jesus in this object lesson brings a little child, and I picture him setting him on his lap and saying, you want to be great in the kingdom? You be like this little child. Every self-respecting preacher who's preached for any length of time has a sermon about this. Become as little children, and that sermon takes two parts. One is we'll talk about some attributes of children that we shouldn't follow. The Bible talks about that. When I was a little child, I thought as a child. And so there's some things we need to grow to maturity. We need to grow out of. But then the second part of that sermon is going to talk about the qualities of children that we ought to emulate and have. And that is certainly Jesus' focus here. And I think he has at least two things in mind. Number one is, in that day, maybe completely opposite somewhat to our culture, in that day, children had no societal standing. They were nothing. They weren't considered when decisions were made. They weren't asked their opinion on things. They weren't consulted about governmental and even family issues. In that day, and I'd probably say even in my day, children found out we were moving when the moving van showed up. Mom and Dad didn't say, do you want to move to this new city so Dad can get a better job? No, they just said, get your things, you're going. They had no societal standing, and so there was that place of humility just built into the fact that you were a child. But also in the way children act. So Jesus singles out really what it is about children that we need to emulate, and it's their humility. Unless you become humble as this little child. And a child does display and portray humility that should be emulated in those who would seek to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. A child will say, hold my hand, I'm scared. A child, help me. A child will ask a question, sometimes 100 questions, if they don't know the answer to something. So Jesus says, you want to have this discussion, who's the greatest? Let's have this discussion. You become humble as a little child. You be willing to ask for help. You be willing to recognize, openly recognize your limitations and your shortcomings and what you cannot do and what you are not and what you need God and maybe even your fellow man, your brothers and sisters in Christ, to help you with. Now he goes on in verse 6, having this child sitting in their midst. And he says in verse 6, but whoever causes one of these little ones. And maybe, and I can almost picture Jesus pointing or gesturing to this little child. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. Now let's pause here and make sure we understand with clarity who he's talking about here. I think there's no doubt he's using this child still as an object lesson. But he's not talking about literal little children. That if we cause little children to stumble. Now, will God judge us for that? Absolutely. But he says, remember, he has just said, you disciples, if you want to really get this kingdom thing right, you need to become as little children. So he's talking to them, not the children. And that's further understood when he says, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. That little child would not have had the capacity to have faith in Jesus Christ in the sense that we understand it, nor would he have had the ability or the capacity to sin. So when he says, whoever causes one of these little ones, he's talking about his followers. If you cause one of your brothers or sisters, you cause a fellow disciple of Jesus Christ to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone, that's a huge, heavy stone. So heavy that it would have been difficult, if not impossible, for one individual just to pick it up. It would be better if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come. But woe to the man by whom the offense comes. You want to be greatest in the kingdom? You want to excel at kingdom living? You humble yourself as a child. And you watch. And you be very careful. You be very careful about what you do. And you be very careful about what you say. And you be very careful about what you don't say. Do whatever you can to keep from offending one of these little children who have humbled themselves and have come to me. Those like the publican who would not even dare look up to heaven and pray, who've humbled themselves and say, I'm lost. I'm a sinner. Who reached out their hand and said, I'm scared. Who asked those questions of Jesus, who said, I need help. And he says, don't you dare offend one of those. That's how you excel at this kingdom thing. And maybe turning it from an offending others to ourselves. He goes in verse 8, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it's better for you to enter into life lame or maimed rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes and being cast into the hell fire. The idea here is that the goal should be so great and so important to us that we would do nothing or allow nothing to keep us from that. If in some sense one part of my body, my hand, is holding me back from getting to heaven, then Jesus says you go to the extreme case of just chopping it off. Get rid of it. Don't let anything keep you from the goal, from the prize. But I think that's not just talking about the lengths to which we will go to get ourselves to heaven, but I think it fits in this context of the lengths that we will go to help others to get there. That's how important this is. And so don't you do anything. And that should give us great pause. Because we need to recognize the power that we possess. The power that you possess just generally to make somebody's day. Do you know you have that power? That you can make somebody's day. You want to prove it? Sometime today, tell me. Say, Ken, you look pretty. Just try it. You'll make my day. That's all I need to get through the rest of the day. Just that one little encouragement. You have that power. You have that power spiritually to get somebody spiritually through the day. Just some word of encouragement. But also recognize the power that you have to absolutely destroy somebody's day. You're ugly. Wow, I didn't need to hear that. Go look in the mirror. Yeah, they kind of got a point. And recognize the power that you possess to ruin somebody's day spiritually, to just tear them down to where they think they can't make it. And Jesus said, you don't want to meet me on the day of judgment if you're that guy. It'd be better if a millstone were hung around your neck and you were cast into the sea. Now, let's pause at this moment. And can you picture those disciples kind of looking at each other awkwardly, realizing that they had asked the question, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus doesn't give them that one word or one name answer. Jesus has given them a talking to about what this kingdom business is really about. Continue in his answer. Verse 10, take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. We'll talk about angels later in our quarter discussion of the spirit world. And I'll tell you then what I tell you now. I don't really know what that means when it says they're angels. But I do understand this, that he says, you be careful. You do not despise one of these little ones. And again, in this context, he's not talking about the little child. The child's the object lesson. He's talking about his followers. But what he says is that heaven has their attention. Heaven cares about them. The angels are mentioned, the Father is mentioned, and Jesus Christ, the Son of Man, is mentioned. They care about that brother or sister of yours. Don't you despise them. Now, despise here, I don't think means the idea of I just absolutely hate that person. Now, it could mean that, and that's certainly sinful. But remember, in this context, they said, who's the greatest? That's a form of despising. I don't have to hate you to despise you. All I have to do is think I'm greater than you. I'm more important than you. I'm more essential or necessary in the kingdom than you. And Jesus says, you need to know that heaven cares about them. In fact, it cares about them this much. Verse 12, what do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains to seek the one who is astray? And if he should find it, assuredly I say to you, he rejoices more over that sheep than over the 99 that did not go astray. Even so, it's not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. We've made the observation, it doesn't make sense to leave 99 to go find one sheep. That doesn't make sense unless you're that one sheep. Then it makes perfect sense. Come find me. I'm lost. And Jesus says, that's how heaven feels about that one individual. And that's how you should feel. It's not about who's the greatest, who's the least. It's about seeing people as God sees them. Verse 15, moreover, who's the greatest, Jesus? Moreover, verse 15, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. And if he hears you, you've gained your brother. But if he will not hear, take with you 2 or 3 more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Do not misunderstand, misinterpret, and misapply this passage. This is not about getting somebody told who offended me. Because it just followed, don't you dare cause somebody to be offended. And it just followed, don't you dare despise someone. Would it not follow that the one I'm not supposed to offend and the one I'm not supposed to despise could also be the one who offended me and sinned against me? The one who Jesus says, don't you despise them. Don't you be the reason that they stumble and fall. The point of this exercise, this 3 or 4 part exercise, you go to them, and if that doesn't work, you take 2 or 3 with you, and then you go, and if that doesn't work, then you involve the whole church about this. This isn't just about getting them disciplined. It's not just about getting them put in their place and getting them told, because you did me wrong. Jesus says, if he hears you, you've gained your brother. That's what it's about. Why do I go? Why do I bring 2 or 3 others? Why do I involve the whole church? Because that's a lost sheep that our Lord would go out into the mountains to find. I can pick up the phone and try to gain my brother. Well, they probably at this point think, oh, we made a mistake. Who is the greatest? Jesus said, who's the greatest? How about you try to be like a child and humble yourself? How about you do everything possible not to offend someone and cause them to stumble? How about you don't look down on people and talk about I'm greater than you? And whatever you do, whatever you can to restore that relationship that you have with those whom you should not despise or offend. But somebody's got a follow-up question. And I give you 3 guesses who it'll be. Peter says, verse 21, Peter came to him and said, Lord, You've been talking about not offending. You've been talking about trying to restore, and somebody sins against us, and the attitude, the charitable kind attitude we should have. Surely there's a limit to that. And maybe Peter's saying, I remember, one time you said something about forgiving people 7 times. And Peter says, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Let's pause there and at least give Peter this credit. Peter understood the point of go to your brother, take 2 or 3, involve the church. It was all about forgiving that brother. It wasn't about getting him told and showing him up and embarrassing him. It was about restoring him, forgiving him. How often? Up to 7 times? Is it 7 times? Is that the limit? And I don't know about you, but I think I'm finding myself too many times in Peter's camp. Peter may have been thinking 7's a whole lot. Not only should 7 be the limit, but 7? Did you really mean? You didn't mean 7 times. Somebody wronging you 7 times? I know that was before baseball, but 3 strikes, you're out, right? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. And don't be like Peter, don't do the math. That wasn't the point. 70 times 7. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle his accounts with his servants. And when he began to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold with his wife and his children and all that he had, and that payment be made. That was a common practice. The servant therefore fell down before him and said, Master, have patience with me, and I'll pay you everything. Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion and released him and forgave the debt. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat and said, Pay me what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, and I'll pay you all. But he would not. He would not. And he went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved, and they came and told the master all that had been done. Then his master, after he had called him, said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And his master was angry and delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due him. So my heavenly Father also will do to each of you from his heart who does not forgive his brother his trespasses. Jesus, who's the greatest? That's not the answer they were expecting, is it? I guarantee it was much longer than what they expected. But its content was not what they expected. You want to be the great, you want to excel in the kingdom of heaven. It's all about humility. It's all about loving. And it's all about forgiving. What's something you're good at? We all like to be good at something. Is there something you're good at that you're not just good at, you're the best? That's a good feeling, isn't it? They wanted to be the greatest, the best. They fought over who would sit right beside you in your kingdom, Lord. And Jesus said, let's talk about the kingdom of heaven. Much as he said to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight. And in this lengthy answer, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If you want to be the best, if you want to excel at kingdom activity, be like this child. And you don't offend, but you seek out and you forgive over and over and over again. Because that's what God's done for you. And God's willing to do that for you today. It doesn't matter what debt you owe Him. It doesn't matter what horrendous sins you've committed, how many times you've committed them. God is that forgiving Master who is willing to erase all of that debt. And all He asks in return is your love, your allegiance, your obedience, and that you be like Him. And you be the one who forgives and helps and loves like He is. You want to be the greatest? Then be like Him. If we can help you in that way and you seek forgiveness of your sins, or if we can help you in any way in your kingdom living, let it be known right now as together we stand and as we sing.